And then, so how much money are we talking about? I don't know if there's an easy example of, if it were somebody that made $100,000 as a round number, spent the entire year abroad, what would that look like in terms of federal taxes? Just so someone has kind of like a number in terms of what
Yeah, I mean, you're
that
looking at
potential tax savings is.
roughly 20 to 25,000 on the federal side, and then again, the state side it might be, upwards of
Another
10,000.
10. Okay, so they could essentially save $35,000 in taxes potentially if they were making
Correct.
$100,000 and lived outside the U.S. versus inside the U.S.
Exactly.
In this episode of the Great Enough Podcast, I speak to Vincenzo, the founder and CEO of Online Taxman. His business helps Americans living abroad pay their U.S. taxes. We're going to talk about your 2020 tax bill, maybe some ways that you could lower your taxes, what it's like living abroad, being a digital nomad, starting a business, and a bunch more. I really think you're going to enjoy this episode. All right, Vincenzo, thanks so much for joining us today. We're closing out 2022, and you being an expert in taxes, I wanted to just really jump in and talk about what someone can do in early 2023 to prepare for their 2022 taxes.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I think there's a lot of planning opportunities, both the end of the year and then even looking ahead next year about what people could do to plan and just optimize their tax situation.
How do you think about how someone should be doing their taxes? When is it okay to just do it online, and when should they be thinking about getting a tax expert?
I think it's a good question. It's really relevant to the complexity of one's situation, right? We have a focus on a lot of expat and digital nomad taxes, right? And so that's one area where once people move outside the United States, that's where they might contact us and obviously help out. But I also just see a lot of people, once you transition, let's say, from just being an employee to being an investor or being an entrepreneur, that's where one, the tax savings really kick in, and then obviously two, just the complexity starts to accrue. Because the U.S. tax system essentially does incentivize people to be investors, people to be entrepreneurs, et cetera. And that's where a lot of the opportunities and strategies start coming in.
And then from there, how do you think about somebody to start getting involved in the things that they can actually benefit from in terms of their taxes? So you said, a W-2, someone who's an employee and their employer takes out their taxes. Is there a lot that they can do to lower their tax bill?
I mean, I think there's a few different strategies even for W-2. I mean, one is, as I mentioned, we focus on expats and digital nomads, and so with remote working, we see a lot of people moving outside the United States, and in doing so, they can eliminate their state taxes, and they could also save up to $108,000 on their federal taxes due to the foreign earned income exclusion, right? Which essentially means if you're a digital nomad or you have a residency somewhere else, and you qualify, meaning you don't live in the States anymore, then you would essentially be able to have this first amount of income tax free. Even for people that aren't ready to move out of the States, switching state taxes from, let's say high tax states like, California, and moving to a place like Florida or Texas or Nevada, would save upwards of 10% on your taxes. So obviously you see a lot of movements to those states. And then third, really starting a business, starting a side hustle, and going in that direction, where you're taking, let's say, some online courses, or buying equipment or supplies, and going that route. Even if in the first couple of years you're incurring losses, those expenses, those losses for a new business would go against your ordinary income, your W-2 income. And so it's sort of a win-win. Obviously, if you end up really doing well with a side hustle and you get supplemental income, or it becomes your full-time thing, that's great. And even if it doesn't, you still get to deduct those expenses against your ordinary income from a W-2 job.
Okay, so that's interesting. So it's something obviously tough closing out 2022, but I think for somebody, we're just starting 2023, if they were to start a side hustle. So for example, we teach people how to create online content and make money from that. So if someone wanted to create a YouTube channel or a podcast or something along those lines, they could potentially buy the equipment. Maybe they need a new laptop to edit videos. Maybe they want to invest in some courses. Those are types of things they could potentially write off if they started a side hustle, where if you don't have some other business you're attempting to start, at least you can't really take those deductions. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously you just need to show an intent, that you're trying to start something, any sort of expenses that are really necessary and ordinary in doing that business. Like you mentioned, sort of someone starting creating content. Yeah, you have, various subscriptions, online courses, all the equipment, so on and so forth. That would all be deductible. And, all the equipment, et cetera, could be deductible in year one under bonus depreciation rules. Again, it all sort of is relevant to the type of expense, but this is definitely a way to deduct expenses, especially against, again, your ordinary income from other things like your job.
Yeah. And so you obviously do taxes for a lot of expats, but you mentioned just moving states can have a huge impact. So for example, people that live or worked in New York City sometimes will move to New Jersey or Connecticut or other states. That you mentioned Florida, Texas, Nevada, some that don't have any income tax. What is kind of the range that someone could potentially pay to their state from the ones that you mentioned to some of the higher cost state taxes?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the higher state taxes are, again, upwards of 10%, especially if you look like New York City. And then you have lower tax states, not really in the tri-state area, but like in New York, but maybe, like I said, down south, thing like the Carolinas, and obviously, I mean, zero tax states like Florida, Tennessee, New Hampshire, Nevada, and Texas, right? And so obviously you see a real movement, particularly to like Florida and Texas, for people to save upwards of 10% in places like California and New York.
Yeah, so you obviously see, not only I think people think more about, what do I pay in rent or for my coffee or to go out to dinner and things like that, but on top of it, having an additional 5-10% of your income in your pocket each year or each month that your paycheck is taken out, even for somebody who's just an employee, can have a huge impact.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think you also need to be very, very aware of if your employee sort of like certain laws that are local laws. Like, for example, there is something called the remote worker law in New York. So if you are an employee of a New York company, you can't just move outside of New York and save on New York taxes, actually. Because unless it's like necessary and ordinary, right? It's part of your job sends you to Florida to work in the Florida office because they need you, right? But if you choose to move to Florida and you're employed of a New York company, technically you can't do that, or you can't save on New York taxes. So you have to be really also aware, state by state basis. California is actually the opposite. Right, you can be an employee of a California company and move to Florida and save taxes there. However, if you receive independent contractor income from a California source, then California could tax you on that. Versus New York, actually, they don't do that. So you could receive independent contractor income from a New York source, and it's not taxable. But if you are independent contracting and have California clients, technically you have to pay California state tax on that income from the California clients. And that's where, you might even want to contact the client and say, hey, do you have an office in New York or another state because that I could bill from? Because again, it wouldn't be taxable. So that's the whole thing. I mean, there are also a lot of state tax nuances. So, I mean, obviously we'll talk in broad strokes, and when applicable, I'm happy to share the knowledge, but it's also something to think about each state's different. Obviously a lot of, like I said, there's high level things like again, you do want to cut ties with these states. You don't want to have, for example, California driver's license, voter registration, any sort of licensing. I mean, I've had people been pulled into the California tax net because they had a real estate broker's license from like years before. So you really want to, obviously, not having any address tied to a place like California. Because let's say you have a random brokerage statement that still has the California address, and you already moved to Texas, California can still try to, claw you back into their system. So there are a lot of things that could be done to sort of preventatively eliminate state tax and just, being drawn back into this tax system, because places like California are very, very aggressive when it comes to stuff. So you want to really cross your T's and dot your I's if you are going to move outside of a state like California for tax purposes.
So that's another kind of good point, as we were talking about, hey, can I just do this on TurboTax or should I hire someone? Obviously, if there are any big change, to understand this might not be something that's picked up correctly, that, for you to not have to pay your California state tax anymore, you need to go through these certain requirements to make that happen. That is not just going to be spit out by an automated system. But if you've, lived in the same place, you only have your normal income, you're probably okay. But as you start to invest or have a business, or there's a big change like a move from one state to another, or obviously we're going to talk a lot about American expats, digital nomads, and that situation, I imagine, also gets much more complex as well.
Yeah, correct. I mean, I think, again, if there's a big change in situation, or, you sort of become an investor, entrepreneur, et cetera, that's where things get interesting.
Okay. And so let's transition to somebody living abroad. How does that change their tax situation? So, I'm in Michigan right now, but we met in Medellin, Colombia. I lived there for a while. I lived in a handful of different countries. And so, how does somebody's tax situation change if they're an American not living in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, so if you're a U.S. citizen, the one thing is no matter where you live in the world, you have to file your U.S. income taxes. And so what that comes down to is, one, again, having to file, but then two, what are the benefits of moving outside the United States? So again, there's a foreign income exclusion, right, which means you get the $108,000 sort of tax-free from U.S. income tax. You still might have to pay Social Security and Medicare, but at least the income
tax. How does that work essentially? So essentially, if I made $85,000, I would not pay federal taxes on that amount of money if I lived abroad?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so up to the 108,000 essentially you wouldn't pay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And what constitutes living abroad? If you're a nomad and you're sort of constantly perpetually traveling, then you can only spend 35 days in the United States in a 365-day period, right? So, let's say somebody moves abroad, July 1st of 2022, fast forward July 1st of 2023, and if they're outside the U.S. or they're in the U.S. for under 35 days, then, we could do sort of a pro rata sort of calculation. So half of 2022 and half of 2023, they're outside, and again, they would qualify for that foreign income exclusion, so that $108,000 would be tax-free.
So it'd be 50-some thousand,
Exactly.
54,000
Correct.
in 2022 and 54,000 in 2023 that they wouldn't pay the federal income tax on?
Right.
And then, so how much money are we talking about? I don't know if there's an easy example of, if it were somebody that made $100,000 as a round number, spent the entire year abroad, what would that look like in terms of federal taxes? Just so someone has kind of like a number in terms of what
you're looking
that
at
potential tax savings
roughly
is.
20 to 25,000 on the federal side, and then again the state side it might be upwards of 10,000.
Another 10.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they could essentially save $35,000 in taxes potentially if they were making $100,000 and lived outside the U.S. versus inside the U.S.
Exactly. And then obviously you have the cost of living, et cetera. That could also be an adjustment. I mean, I think it's, for me personally, and this is obviously, what happened when I moved abroad was, it saved me so much money on taxes. I ended up, being able to invest that money in my business and grow my business. And then, of course, just I think the experience of living abroad is so valuable to, get outside of your comfort zone, learn a new language, and just meet, other travelers and other people that are on the same journey. I think is awesome.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that, because we talked a little bit about what you do as far as your day job of helping people with their taxes, and clearly there's some benefits there. But tell me a little bit about, where you grew up, spending time in the U.S., and then kind of the transition to what it's been like since moving outside the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in New York, and basically was in New York my whole life. I actually went to school in Michigan, came back to New York, was working in a big accounting firm, and then roughly 12 years ago, during sort of that 2010 crisis, I ended up moving down to Buenos Aires, Argentina, really just on a sort of a spur of the moment. I want to learn Spanish, and sort of try this expat lifestyle. And once I got there and really started like living, right? Because it's such a transition from when you're in vacation mode and going to these places versus actually living in a place like that. I decided that I didn't want to go back to New York, right? I mean, it was just, the quality of life there was really good. I surrounded myself with a group of really good friends and good people. And then that's when I said, hey, I need to obviously figure out a way to stay. And, I was an accountant by trade. There was a lot of people down there that were asking for U.S. tax advice because there was a lot of expats there. There was a lot of Argentinos, too, that had U.S. companies and bank accounts. And, I just built a website and, met somebody who knew how to do Google AdWords. He started doing that. And then there was this sort of eureka moment when customers started coming to my website, and I was like, wow, this could really help. This could really work. And, from there, it sort of spiraled and snowballed, and I built a team, and one of my best friends is my business partner, came down to help me build the company, and and obviously the rest is history. So I think that's the beautiful part about when you take a chance to move to a new country, and like I said, you have all of a sudden extra money that you can pump into the business because you're not paying like New York rent prices and paying New York City taxes and this and that. That's where, candidly, sometimes like the magic happens, and you never know, right? And then my whole point is I could have always gone back to be an accountant in New York, but luckily, obviously, things worked out, and here I am still, years later, living outside the United States, and I love it.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think this idea or something like this could have happened if you had just stayed in New York, or was it the fact of kind of doing something completely different, putting yourself in a different environment that allowed you to kind of take a step back, have that thought process, and then kind of creatively and kind of just through meeting people realize that this opportunity existed of, hey, there's a different way that you could make money from your skill set living on the other side of the world, essentially?
I think there's a lot of opportunities, and I think part of it is once you get out of your sort of like your regular routine and put yourself in another situation, inspiration ends up happening, right? And so I do agree that there was a combination of me being ready for that transition and sort of wanting it, and then being around people and being inspired and sort of understanding what was needed there, and I think a lot of times when you go to these different countries, especially from an American perspective, from a capitalist and really entrepreneur perspective, because I think the U.S. really does encourage entrepreneurship and side hustling and this and that. You're able to sort of see the gaps locally or talk to people and realize what the potential is, right? And so I do think that putting myself in that environment certainly helped launch the business and where it is today.
Yeah, I kind of had a similar experience when I moved to Columbia. So just graduated from business school, got a job there, and then it was again kind of a similar story of living someplace else, of just seeing things differently, and then different business ideas started coming to me, and being able to test those out, and again having saving a ton of money as far as the income by living in a place like Colombia or Buenos Aires, or you're in Brazil right now, I think was a great moment that allowed me to make that transition from employee to entrepreneur.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I see these sort of success stories all the time, right? Because obviously these are the people that work with these clients or that I meet with in, the quote unquote digital nomad trail of just, people that again are all in these type of hubs, whether it's like Medellin, Colombia, where we met, places like Bali, obviously around Europe, etc., Asia, Thailand. So, I mean, these sort of communities and the amount of idea exchange and just collaboration, I think it's great. There's so many of these like little mini ecosystems around the world, both in person, even online, through Facebook groups and, Dynamite Circle and all these other sort of, digital nomad entrepreneur organizations.
Yeah, where you see people moving to as far as Americans moving abroad right now?
I mean, I see a lot of people. Mexico has always been really popular. I mean, different parts of Mexico, whether it's like Playa del Carmen, Tulum, Mexico City, the West Coast like Puerto Escondido, Bali, Thailand like Chiang Mai, Medellin, Colombia, Florianopolis, Brazil. A lot of places. Of course, Europe. You have Portugal. You have Spain. So it's sort of there's an abundance of places. Again, depending on people's preferences, both weather-wise and culture-wise, etc.
What recommendations would you have for somebody that's thinking about starting the digital nomad life? They're living in the U.S. right now. They say, starting 2023, I want to be somewhere else in the world. What kind of steps would you recommend for them?
Yeah, I would just say, listen, take a shot. Go to a place for a month. I always feel like a month is a good time is if you want to do an exploratory trip, right? A month will get your quote unquote feet wet and you'll get a feel for what the vibe is there. But at the same time, I always feel like a month is too short to like really, really live there. Meaning right after that, month period or whatever it is, 3-4 weeks, you just are starting to really like, understand how things work and, find your local restaurant or coffee shop, maybe, meet some friends and create some relationships. And then, then obviously if you end up having to go back, then, you at least get a good feel for it. But I think, again, putting on that, trying a place on for size, so to speak, for a month, I think really is a good time period. And so, identify a few places. Obviously, I like to do it based on, weather and time of year. And do a little research beforehand, find some Facebook groups or, go online and find some forums and pick a few places and try a few places on for size. I mean, a lot of people like to, bop around and really be, very, very nomadic, which I think is great. I do think it does get tiring after a while, and there really is a value in finding a community and just staying in one place. But I think for people that are sort of new to this lifestyle, try a few places on for size and see ultimately what calls you.
And so would you recommend someone, let's say their lease is up, to just be like, I'm going to live abroad now? Or would you recommend first doing this 1 month test of, hey, I still have my place in New York or wherever it happens to be, but let's try living somewhere else for 1 month, see if I like it, and then kind of make the decision from there, versus like just, I'm going to put all my stuff in storage, see what happens in life, and roll the dice in a way?
I don't know. I think that's sort of like, what way do you like to remove a Band-Aid? Do you know what I mean? I'm more of I just like to rip it. Some people are, they want to sort of just like while in, etc. But I think generally, but again, this is my preference, is you just got to take the dive. Because, if you, keep your apartment in New York or wherever, then obviously you're going to go back to it. Versus if you really want to sort of take the plunge, just take the plunge. And then if you decide after a few months or whatever that you don't like it, then fine. Then just go back to New York and get a new apartment. Right. But I do think there's and again, maybe this is definitely difficult for some people, right? Some people want to be in control. They don't like the unknown, so on. And so I understand, the other side of it, which is, let me just do baby steps. But I think for me to really ultimately feel that level of freedom and ultimate acceptance of a lifestyle as such, you really just have to take the plunge and book the one-way ticket and see what happens.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. That's kind of how I've made decisions too. So, for example, I don't pay rent right now, and so I'm in Michigan with my family for a little bit, and I spent essentially the entire year abroad. So my colleagues live in Mexico City. I spent a handful of months there. The one recommendation that fits along with yours is, so I spent 2 months in Europe over the summer, but I wasn't anywhere for more than 2 weeks,
Right.
And it's just too short. Anything less than that, it was like finding the grocery store, coffee shop, just developing a routine where, for example, I just spent a month in Toronto, and there I felt a little bit more like home. So here's where I go get groceries. Here's where I'll do this. The people at the coffee shop recognize me, start to make a couple local friends. And, having that amount of time in whatever city that you might be thinking about moving to gives you, you're not going to be an expert on the entire city or have this huge group of friends potentially, but at least I think at that point you could kind of imagine what would your life potentially be like if you were to settle down there. And then I think exactly with your point too of, when I had spent less than, when I was traveling in Europe, it was just, it's hard to be productive. It's hard to have a routine. It was really tiring versus, having a place that almost starts to feel like home before you potentially move on to another location.
I agree. And that's even why, right now I live in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I mean, there's definitely times where I'll go and travel for a few weeks or a month or, whatever. But I think it's always nice to just have a place to come home to and, have that sort of all your stuff and routine, et cetera, in one place.
Yeah. And so tell me about making the decision to live in Brazil or spend the majority of your time in Brazil.
For me, obviously I've lived in several places. I lived in Buenos Aires, Argentina for a few years. I lived in Medellin, Colombia for a few years where we met. And now Brazil, which sort of is something that, for a few years I was actually quite nomadic, bopping around between, a few places like Colombia, Mexico, Europe, etc. And I think it was actually during COVID where I really felt, hey, I forgot it's nice to have a routine. It's nice to really settle, and I've always loved Brazil. I've traveled here so many, times over the years. And that's when I decided to actually really settle and whatnot. And then Brazil became a lot more accessible, meaning that they, came out with like a digital nomad visa and so on. Which was always a little bit more difficult before to sort of get a residency here in Brazil. So then that was what made me ultimately come here.
When did you start learning Portuguese? I guess because I'm getting at this is of a lot of people that would maybe find places on a map or they read articles about, hey, it's amazing to live in Medellin, Colombia, or Rio, or Lisbon, Portugal, or whatever the country happens to be. And you're like, well, their first language is in English, so how necessary is it to speak a foreign language in some of the places you've been? And, what recommendations to kind of be able to have more local conversations and learn whatever language that the country happens to speak?
Listen, I mean, from a personal standpoint, I think that assimilation is important. Well, I think that learning a local language is really important to like truly assimilate. And, there are a lot of places that you don't need to learn that you could speak English, right? I mean, you go around places in Mexico, especially like places like Playa del Carmen or Mexico City, for example. I mean, you could really go around and speak English and be fine. And especially places where, like Bali or Thailand, for example. They're so used to tourism, that's fine. But I do ultimately think if you're going to truly pick a place to live, you should at least make an attempt to learn the local language. I mean, obviously, LATAM is easy because, Spanish, even Portuguese, they're very useful languages to know, right? I mean, Spanish, you get around basically a whole continent outside of, the Guianas and Brazil with Spanish. And for me, it was sort of, well, the first things I did was start taking Spanish classes. And I think it's also using the opportunity, because obviously to really learn a language, you do want to be in that place, practicing every day, getting in these real life situations, etc. So it's almost like using the opportunity while you can to achieve fluency in a language, versus living in the U.S. and taking online classes in Spanish. Sure, like you'll be better, and maybe you'll go to like the local bodega or Mexican restaurant or whatever, and get to practice with the waiter, but it doesn't compare to living in a place like Mexico and having to use it on the daily.
Yeah, no, I had a similar experience. So I was living in New York when I started learning Spanish, and so I had class for 90 minutes once a week, and I would try to listen to podcasts or read the paper or do something. But I think 2 years of doing that, I learned less than 2 weeks of taking intensive Spanish classes in Buenos Aires, of just 24/7 being around it, how quickly you can pick up a foreign language, and then how great it is of, it's funny, in all sorts of random cities, I have conversations in Spanish now. I could be somewhere in Europe or, in New York City. There's probably days where I could almost, go the entire day without speaking English. And so it's a great skill to have and obviously to assimilate. And I think, it's something that I definitely recommend for anybody. Obviously, we were just talking about, hey, if you're thinking about moving abroad somewhere, maybe rip off the Band-Aid and be like, I'm going to spend 2023 living someplace else. Are there any kind of practical steps that someone should take as far as, like you were saying of, hey, maybe I don't want to pay my state taxes. That could be an issue. Can I qualify for, the living abroad credit? I forget the exact name for. What are the things that someone would want to just have lined up before they're going to go live as a digital nomad?
No, I think it comes down to sort of researching what the well, like I said, taking sort of the plunge, and then really like when it comes to logistics, ultimately you're gonna keep everything in the States. At least when it comes to like banking and maybe even healthcare and so on and so forth. I think it really just sort of depends on how much you want to commit to this lifestyle, and how you want to deal with the logistics, right? Meaning some people, right, they want to move countries every month, whereas others are more sort of stable as far as getting a residency, getting a local bank account, and lease, and so on and so forth. So, and I think it's also mindset, right? I mean, again, what sort of environment you want to put yourself in, right? Do you want to live in like a city? Do you want to live in sort of like a beach area? Ultimately what culture you connect with. A lot of people love Asia. And sort of connect to that side. I mean, obviously, I'm a big South American guy, so ultimately, what calls you.
And so one other thing related to that so for example, someone is going to travel once a month to different countries. They probably don't fall into this, but as you were saying, if someone wants to get a local bank account, have a new home, when does someone actually have to think about paying tax in the country that they're spending time in, or how does that whole process work?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, because I think that is a big factor when you think about where you want to move and whatnot. Is really what is the local tax situation, right? And the rule of thumb is 183 days, right? Meaning if you spend over half the year in a place, you generally become a tax resident of that place. And then the second part of that is, well, how are you getting paid? Do you have your own U.S. company? Are you just an employee of that company? How does that work, right? Because maybe the company's subject to tax, or sometimes there's these remote workers, and they might work for a big company or maybe a small company, and there's concerns over, well, if you live in this place for over 183 days, then we as a company are going to be subject to tax. There's these things known as a permanent establishment rules that are there, and so a lot of times it is just sort of high level understanding the local tax situation. Then it also comes into what's enforceability, right? I mean, when you look at like European countries or the States for that matter, there's a lot more enforceability, right? The taxman's coming after you. Sometimes it's some of the more developing, world countries, whether it's Indonesia, Bali, or Mexico or Argentina or wherever, there might not be as much enforceability. And people are just more open to taking risks, right? I mean, when we manage people's finances, tax situations, we only do the U.S. side. And I always advise people, of course, to get in touch with local accountants. And a lot of times we have local accountants that we refer people, etc. But it is a lot of times up to the discretion of the client. And some people are more, adamant about understanding the local tax implications and concerns. Some people are really candidly more open to taking risks. And that's also up to you and your decision-making tree.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. So I was going to say, just to kind of wrap that up. So if someone's spending half the year or more, or if that's a possibility, to think about talking to someone about their local taxes. If someone were going to be spending a handful of months, say 3 or 4 months in different countries, then probably not an issue in terms of being a tax resident.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, again, from a broad perspective, I think that sometimes there's more refined rules about, oh, well, you're working in this country while you're there, and so there might be subject to taxation, or really just one's interpretation, et cetera, and how conservative they are.
So yeah, especially around election time, you hear people kind of complain about one side or the other of like, I'm going to leave the country, give up my American citizenship. One thing I noticed, obviously, of spending a lot of time abroad is Americans are the only or one of few countries where if you're not actually living in the country, you still have to pay taxes to the U.S. Are there people that you work with that are actively thinking about giving up their U.S. citizenship?
Yeah. I mean, it is the U.S. And Eritrea, which is a small African country, are the only two countries that tax on worldwide income. And, people that do live in the United States for, and really don't have any plans on going back to the U.S., right? Because, if you give up your U.S. citizenship, then you're essentially saying that I no longer want to live in the United States, because if you want to go back to the United States and you're no longer a citizen, you would have to go through the same immigration process like anyone else. And so, we've helped really many people who want to give up their U.S. citizenship with the renunciation process. People that, let's say they were just naturalized in the United States, they lived there for 10, 20 years, then they're back in their home country or somewhere else, or somebody who's an American but start a family elsewhere, and again, their life is in that other country, and they don't want to live in the U.S. anymore. They don't want to have to deal with the compliance requirements, right? I mean, as a U.S. citizen living abroad, again, you have to file every year. Yes, you do get the foreign income exclusion, the first $108,000, but let's say somebody lives in a low tax jurisdiction like a Singapore or Hong Kong, where their local tax is a lot less and they're making over this $108,000 mark. Again, they might not want to pay that difference to the United States. Again, the U.S. also has a lot of other filing requirements, like reporting all your foreign bank accounts, reporting all your foreign companies and trusts, etc. And so, again, somebody who's set on living abroad, they might not want to do all that compliance stuff, because it could be quite burdensome and expensive for them. And so, again,
what's the process? What's the actual process to renounce your citizenship? I have no idea how that.
Yeah, no,
that
I mean,
works.
basically, what you need to do is first you want to have another passport, right? Because obviously, if you give up U.S. citizenship, you need to have citizenship somewhere else. Otherwise, you're sort of stateless, and means that you can't travel. So you want to have another passport. You set an appointment with the U.S. Embassy, either where you live or maybe in another country, and you go and you have a conversation with the embassy officer. You tell them about why you want to renounce. You have to do sort of like a questionnaire. I think the biggest question that they ask is, why you want to renounce, and the answer that you shouldn't give is that you want to renounce for tax purposes, right? Because you can't do that. So you could, say, of course, your reasoning behind it. I'm, don't plan on moving back to the United States. I have a closer connection with, this country. My family's here, etc. And again, you go through the questionnaire, and then you just formally renounce. You have to take an oath that you renounce the U.S. Citizenship. So it could be one or two appointments depending on the embassy. Sometimes the first appointment's a dial-in. The second appointment, you go in and you formally do the oath, and you get a certificate of lost nationality, and so on. Then on the tax side, you have to do a final U.S. tax return, which means that basically, up until the day before you renounce, you have to file your U.S. taxes as if you're a citizen. Then at the day of renouncing and afterwards, you might still have to file a U.S. tax return if you have like U.S. source income, like if you have a U.S. Rental property or whatnot. And so you have to do this sort of final dual status tax return. Up until that date. I think another thing to note is that if you are over $2 million of net worth, then you're considered a covered expat. And a covered expat means that you could be subject to an exit tax, which essentially means that up to, that basically it's a hypothetical sale of your assets as of the day that you renounce. And you could pay a capital gains tax on that. And then there's other implications. If you have like U.S. retirement accounts, they might be liquidated that day. You might have to pay tax on that. So it might not be tax beneficial to be a covered expat. And there's also potential ways of getting under that $2 million threshold by gifting assets and so on. So
it's pretty complicated for high net worth individuals.
100%. Yeah.
Okay. Are there other fees associated with it too?
You have to pay the U.S. Embassy. I think it's like $2,350. It's like around $2,000 something dollars. There's other forms. You have to fill out this 8854 form that shows all the value of the assets to determine if you're a covered expat or not. It is a fairly complicated process. It's one that, of course, again, we help people handle. But that's definitely something where I would enlist the help of a professional for that.
For sure. To close on a more fun, interesting note, a question I have for you is, what advice do you have for somebody who is, one, potentially thinking about moving abroad, living a digital nomad life, and for entrepreneurs as well? So I think for those two people, obviously, you had a very typical corporate life in New York, and you made quite a big transition to having your own business and living right now in Rio, but have traveled kind of all over. So how would you recommend someone who's kind of interested in following a similar path?
Listen, I would just say, take a chance, shoot your shot. I always have the belief that you could always go back to your former life, whether it's in New York or working in, finance like I was or wherever. It's about really trying it out and seeing if it works for you. Because, the worst case, you do go back. The best case, you create a business, you create a lifestyle, and again, even if you do have to go back, you still have some stories, and really, you don't live with any regrets, right? And I think that that's one of the most important things in life is making sure that you tried everything you need to try. You don't have regrets. You don't have sort of like the woulda, coulda, shoulda scenario, and that you you do that. And like I said, I mean, I think it is just, whether you're sort of conservative or want to do your research and do some baby step type of approach or not. I mean, I've seen so many success stories where people have tried this out and really, flew, right? And sort of were able to follow their goals, their dreams, and just, live the lifestyle they want to live.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think there's so many people that are interested in potentially doing this, but I don't think they have the same attitude of what the worst case scenario is, which is, or going full time again on my own business. So, I definitely see that being an opportunity. I wish more people would just kind of look at it from that perspective. And the best time is now to give it a shot. And worst case scenario, come back someday to the U.S.
Listen, Jeff, I mean, me and you are living proof of this. I mean, we both have had our past. We've both, done well and have lived this lifestyle and have this sort of freedom. And, for me, I mean, freedom is, and flexibility is your most valuable asset, right? I mean, a lot of people, especially I think when you're younger, you live as if your time on this earth is unlimited, right? And it's always like, next year, No, it's like, no. I mean, the time is always now, right? Because you never know what next year will bring. And it is about sort of just taking the plunge and seeing what happens. Because the worst case, you could go back and go to your sort of, your situation. And we're both lucky, and privileged, to be from a country like the United States, where it is a land of opportunity, and there's so many opportunities again to go back. But if you want to again take this opportunity to live outside the U.S., again, you might as well do it, because it's not like somebody from some of these developing world countries that we live in that don't have this opportunity. Do you know what I mean? So shoot it, because it's really special to be from a developing world country that enables you to even have this flexibility, both like economically and obviously passport wise and so on.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Well, yeah, amazing advice. Well, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's great. I mean, it's great to talk to you. It's great. It's always great to connect. I mean, I feel like we've always sort of like, see each other around the world, whether it's Mexico, Colombia, wherever, obviously virtually. So it's always good to talk to you, Jeff.
And before we close, what's the best way to get in touch with you if somebody's looking for help with their taxes?
Yeah. So onlinetaxman.com. We give out consultations. There's a lot of content on our blog about tax implications and living abroad. I also have a book, Taxes for Americans Abroad, that also sort of details what it's like to live abroad, the tax implications. It's probably the most action. And I hate to say it, but a lot of people have told me this, so I will say it. It is one of the books that has some of the most actionable advice out there. There's other books. But candidly, when I was writing this book, the first thing I did was read everyone else's book, so I could see how much, what can I do better than them, or what sort of advice I could do that really helps people, because there's just a lot of fluff out there, and I'm just a believer in really giving people the most information they could give, them to dissect it, and then obviously if they need help, they could come back to us. So, yeah, I think that's very helpful too for a lot of people out there. So it's on Amazon and Kindle and you paperback if you like. So I think that's helpful too for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, amazing. So anyone that needs help with their taxes, you can check out their website. If you want just a first look of what some of the implications are for living abroad, definitely check out his book. I really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Great Enough Podcast with Vincenzo. If you want to watch another one of my interviews, you can do that along the side right here. Hope to see you in another video. Bye-bye.